The heat rose from the blacktop in shimmering waves, thick enough to taste. It carried the acrid perfume of scorched metal, antifreeze, and something metallic and coppery that clung to the back of the throat. For Lena Washington, it was the smell of the platinum 10 minutes, that sliver of time after a catastrophic injury where the human body is a battleground, and she was the frontline commander. She was 4 minutes in, her knees planted on asphalt that was trying to melt the rubber of her boots, her entire existence compressed into the mangled cab of a Ford F-150 that had wrapped itself around an oak tree. Her patient's name was Robert Miller, a 48-year-old construction foreman, though she wouldn't know that for hours. At this moment, he was just a series of failing numbers and a pair of eyes wide with a terror she'd seen 1,000 times before. He was trapped, the steering column having crushed his lower body in a brutal embrace of steel and plastic. "Blood pressure is 90/60 and falling," she called out, her voice a calm, steady instrument against the chaotic symphony of the scene. Her partner, Sam Jones, a solid, unflappable man she'd worked with for 7 years, was on the other side, coordinating with the fire rescue crew. The roar of their hydraulic rescue tool, the jaws of life, was a monstrous, grinding sound as it bit into the truck's B-pillar. "Tachycardic at 140. Let's get a large-bore IV in his right arm, Sam. We need to push fluids now." At 37, Lena had been a paramedic in the sprawling, sun-bleached city of Westlake for 15 years. Before this, she'd been an Army combat medic, treating blast injuries in the dust-choked chaos of Kandahar. She had performed emergency cricothyrotomies in the back of a shuddering Black Hawk and packed wounds under a sky streaked with tracer fire. She had earned a Bronze Star for valor, not for aggression, but for a courage so profound it seemed to calm the very air around her. With her hair pulled back in tight, disciplined braids and a gaze that could pinpoint a collapsed vein from 10 feet away, she was the person you didn't know you needed until your world shattered into a million pieces. The fire crew, muscles straining, let out a collective grunt. With a final, agonizing shriek of tortured metal, the passenger side door was torn from its hinges. It wasn't much, but it was enough. While Sam secured the IV line, feeding saline into a body desperately trying to shut down, Lena was already a blur of motion. Her gloved hands moved with an economy born of countless repetitions. Airway clear, pupils sluggish but reactive, rapid trauma assessment. Her fingers palpated his abdomen, searching for the telltale signs of internal catastrophe. It was rigid, distended, a classic sign of a massive internal hemorrhage. His breathing was a shallow, frantic hiss. This man wasn't just injured, he was actively dying. "We need to get him out now," she yelled over the whine of the hydraulics. "Let's get the KED on him, on my count." The Kendrick extrication device was a specialized vest for stabilizing the spine during removals from tight spaces. It was a delicate, dangerous ballet, a choreography of controlled urgency where every member of the team had a part to play. The firefighters moved in, their heavy turnout gear adding to the oppressive heat. Sam prepared the backboard on the gurney just feet away. Lena took control of Robert Miller's head and neck, the fulcrum point of the entire operation. They were a single, cohesive unit, bound by a shared purpose, to cheat death out of another victim. In that moment of intense, focused synchronicity, a new sound sliced through the humid air, the sharp, imperious chirp of a police siren, quickly silenced. A patrol car had arrived, its flashing blue and red lights adding a frantic, strobing pulse to the scene. A police officer was striding toward them, his boots crunching on the shattered safety glass that littered the road. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a fresh military-style haircut that was sharp and severe. His uniform was crisp, his posture ramrod straight, a man who seemed to have mistaken the scene of a medical emergency for a parade ground. He moved with an unyielding confidence, his eyes sweeping the area not with a question of how to assist, but with an immediate assessment of what was out of place. His name tag, polished to a high sheen, read M. Thorne. "This ambulance is blocking the eastbound lane," he announced, his voice sharp, carrying an edge of irritation that was jarringly out of place. "You need to move it." Sam looked up from the KED straps he was tightening, his brow furrowed in a mask of pure confusion. "We're in the middle of a Priority 1 extrication, officer. We've got a critical patient here." He gestured with his head toward the mangled truck. The situation seemed self-explanatory. The ambulance was parked at an angle behind the wreck, a standard procedure known as blocking, creating a protective barrier between the active rescue scene and any potential traffic. It was a shield built of steel and flashing lights, but Officer Thorne wasn't looking at the rescue. His gaze was fixed on the ambulance as if its placement were a personal insult. "I don't care what you've got," he shot back, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "You're impeding the flow of traffic. I want it moved, now." Lena didn't look up. She couldn't. Her hands were a steady, reassuring presence on either side of Robert Miller's head, her fingers maintaining cervical spine immobilization. "Stay with us, Robert," she said, her voice low and soothing, a lifeline of calm in his ocean of pain. "We're almost there." Then, without turning her head, she raised her voice just enough to cut through the noise. "That vehicle isn't moving until my patient is safely on his way to the hospital. We have a life-threatening emergency, officer." It was a statement of fact, delivered with the flat professional certainty of someone who had absolute command of her environment. In the complex ecosystem of an emergency scene, there was a clear, unwritten hierarchy born of simple logic. At a medical scene, EMS was in charge of the patient. At a fire scene, the fire captain was in charge of the blaze. The police role was crucial. They secured the perimeter, directed traffic far from the scene, and investigated the cause. But they did not, under any circumstances, interfere with the immediate, life-saving actions of medics and firefighters. It was a protocol of mutual respect that had been the bedrock of interagency cooperation for decades. Officer Mark Thorne, however, seemed to have been absent for that lesson. His jaw tightened. To him, this wasn't a professional clarification, it was insubordination. He had given an order, and a paramedic, a black woman, his mind registered with a flicker of unconscious bias, had just defied him in front of the fire department. "Ma'am, that wasn't a request," he said, taking a step closer. "Move the ambulance or I'll have it towed and write you a citation for obstruction." The firefighters, who had been moving with fluid efficiency, paused. A subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation rippled through the team. The seamless coordination of the rescue had just been fractured. The platinum 10 minutes were ticking away, and a man who believed his badge was a crown had just appointed himself king of a life-or-death situation, ready to start a war over a parking spot. Lena felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. This wasn't about traffic. This was about power. And her patient, Robert Miller, was about to become a casualty of that power struggle. The air, already thick with heat and tension, grew heavier still. The focus of the scene had shifted from the dying man in the truck to the brewing confrontation on the asphalt. The fire captain, a grizzled veteran named Bill Davis, stepped forward. He was a large man, his face etched with the wisdom of 1,000 fires and 100 tragic accidents. He positioned himself carefully, a human buffer between the unyielding officer and the delicate operation. "Officer," Captain Davis said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded respect. "The paramedic is correct. Our engine is blocking the other lane. The road is secure. We are in the middle of a critical phase of the extrication. The ambulance stays where it is until the patient is loaded." He was offering Thorne a way out, a professional clarification from a fellow commanding officer that would allow him to back down without losing face. Thorne's gaze flickered to Captain Davis, and any hope of a quick de-escalation vanished. He saw the captain's intervention not as helpful guidance, but as a gang-up, another challenge to the authority he felt was absolute. "Captain, with all due respect, this is a police matter now," Thorne said, his voice hardening. "Scene management falls under my purview. That ambulance is a hazard and it needs to be moved." He was doubling down, his pride now fully engaged and blinding him to the life-and-death reality just feet away. The absurdity of the statement was breathtaking. The scene was managed by the dozen highly trained professionals already working on it. He was the only element of chaos. Lena knew she couldn't afford to waste another second on this. Every moment they argued was a moment Robert Miller's blood pressure dropped, a moment his brain was starved of oxygen. "Sam, forget him," she commanded, her voice sharp, pulling the focus back to where it belonged. "Let's get this KED secured. Let's move. On my count. 1, 2, 3. The team, jolted back into action by her command, moved with renewed urgency. They slid the KED vest around Robert's torso, the straps and buckles a complex web designed to keep his spine immobile. The movement, however gentle, jostled him. A deep, guttural moan escaped his lips, and his eyes fluttered, glassy with shock and pain. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy sheen, clammy with the cold sweat of decompensated shock. Lena recognized the signs with a sickening lurch in her gut. They were losing him. The internal bleeding was accelerating. "He's about to code!" she yelled, her professional calm cracking with urgency. "Move, people, let's move!" They began the final, critical maneuver, lifting him from the seat and onto the waiting backboard. It was a frantic but controlled race against the clock. Officer Thorne watched, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set like concrete. The sight of them pointedly ignoring his lawful order seemed to stoke the fire of his indignation. He took another step forward, his shadow falling over Lena as she worked. "I gave you a direct order, paramedic," he said, his voice low and menacing, meant for her alone. "You are now obstructing a police investigation." It was a threat, plain and simple. "This isn't an investigation, it's a rescue," Lena shot back, her focus never leaving her patient. She was securing the final strap across Robert's chest. "My only job right now is to keep this man alive. Your job should be to help me do it." For Officer Thorne, this was the final insult. He had been on the force for 6 years, and in that time he had cultivated a rigid black-and-white view of the world. There were those who followed his commands, and there were those who were criminals. Any hesitation, any questioning of his authority was not a nuance to be considered, but an act of defiance to be crushed. He had a history, a file with a dozen citizen complaints for excessive brusqueness and an aggressive attitude, though none had ever led to more than a slap on the wrist. In his mind, Lena Washington was not just questioning him, she was resisting. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder epaulette. "Dispatch, this is Unit 214. I have a non-compliant subject at this scene. A paramedic is refusing to follow lawful orders and is obstructing." Sam Jones froze mid-motion, the backboard forgotten. "Are you kidding me right now?" he stammered, his face a mask of disbelief. "We're trying to save a man's life." Thorne didn't even glance at him. "Your partner should have considered that before she decided to obstruct justice," he said coldly. The words were so detached from the reality of the situation that they sounded like they were from a different planet. He then did the unthinkable. As Lena and a firefighter lifted the backboard to slide it toward the gurney, Thorne stepped directly into her path. He put a hand up, palm out, a gesture of absolute authority. "You're not going anywhere." Lena looked from his hand to his face. The disconnect was terrifying. She saw no reason, no logic, no glimmer of understanding. All she saw was a cold, hard wall of ego. "Officer," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm level that belied the fury building inside her. "Get out of my way. You are actively, physically interfering with emergency medical services. That is a felony." She had given him the law, thrown his own rule book back at him. It was like tossing a lit match into a puddle of gasoline. Thorne's eyes narrowed into slits. The challenge to his authority was now explicit. He couldn't back down. She had made this a confrontation. She was the one escalating. "You think you can tell me the law?" he snarled. "I am the law." He reached for her arm. It was a breathtaking violation of every conceivable protocol, of every shred of professional courtesy that allows first responders to function in chaotic environments. The firefighters stared, their mouths agape. Captain Davis, who had been directing his men, started forward again. Thorne, stand down! That is a direct order from a scene commander. But Thorne was no longer listening. He was locked in a tunnel vision of his own making. In his mind, he was not harming a rescue, he was restoring order. He was putting a defiant woman back in her place. He didn't see the dying man on the backboard or the frantic efforts of the medical team. He saw only a challenge to his uniform, and he was determined to win. "Sam, get the gurney," Lena yelled, trying to sidestep the officer. "We are leaving!" But Thorne moved with her, a human wall. He was taller and heavier, and he used his physical presence as a weapon of intimidation. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice flat and final. And this time, his hand didn't just gesture. It clamped down on her bicep, his fingers digging into her flesh with surprising strength. "You're being detained." The world seemed to warp and slow. The distant sound of traffic, the hum of the fire engine, the desperate, rapid beeping of the cardiac monitor they'd attached to Robert. It all faded into a dull, roaring background noise. All Lena could feel was the crushing pressure of his hand on her arm and the chilling, sickening realization that this officer was willing to let a man die, right here on the hot asphalt, just to prove he was in charge. She had stared down armed men in a war zone who had shown more respect for the sanctity of a medic's work. "Let go of my arm, officer," Lena said, her voice a low, steady growl. She didn't pull away. She knew any sudden movement would be twisted, reframed as resistance, as an assault. She held her ground, a statue of pure, unadulterated professional defiance. "My patient is in hemorrhagic shock. He has minutes, maybe seconds, before he goes into irreversible cardiac arrest. Do you understand what I am telling you?" She was giving him one last chance, one final off-ramp to de-escalate and pretend this was all a terrible misunderstanding. She was appealing to whatever shred of humanity or reason he had left. But Officer Thorne wasn't hearing her words. He was hearing only the tone, a tone that was not submissive. "You're done giving orders," he snarled, his grip tightening. With a sudden violent jerk, he yanked her away from the backboard. The force was so abrupt that Lena stumbled. One of the firefighters instinctively reached out to steady her, but Thorne shot him a venomous look. "Don't get involved." The fragile ecosystem of the rescue shattered. Frank Mercer lay on the backboard, his life literally in the hands of a team that had just lost its leader. "Someone get my patient!" Lena cried out, her voice finally breaking, not with fear for herself, but with raw terror for the man she was being forced to abandon. "Sam, go! Don't wait for me, just go!" Riley spun her around, wrenching her arms behind her back with a practiced, painful efficiency. The metallic rasp of handcuffs being pulled from their leather pouch was obscenely loud. He wasn't just detaining her, he was arresting her. "What are the charges?" Lena demanded, her mind reeling. "Obstruction of governmental administration and resisting arrest," Thorne recited, the words sounding cold and rehearsed. The handcuffs were cold against her skin. He ratcheted them down, the metal teeth biting into her wrists. The final, definitive click of the lock was the sound of a line being crossed from which there would be no return. Captain Davis was already on his radio, his voice a furious, incredulous roar that cut through the disbelief. "Dispatch, I need a police supervisor on scene immediately. I have an officer obstructing EMS operations, and he has just arrested the lead paramedic on a critical trauma call." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, tinny and confused. "Captain, can you repeat that? You're saying the paramedic is under arrest?" "You heard me," Davis bellowed. "Get a sergeant out here now before this officer causes a death." Thorne ignored him completely. He gripped Lena's cuffed arm, the pressure a constant, humiliating reminder of her powerlessness, and began marching her toward his patrol car. She could see Sam and two firefighters scrambling to get the backboard onto the gurney. Their movements, once so precise and synchronized under her direction, were now clumsy, rushed, and desperate. They slammed the ambulance doors shut. Sam jumped into the driver's seat and peeled away from the curb, tires squealing, sirens screaming into the afternoon heat. He was gone, leaving a cloud of diesel exhaust and stunned fury in his wake. He was alone with a dying man, racing toward a hospital that was 15 minutes away. 15 minutes that Robert Miller almost certainly did not have. As Thorne shoved Lena into the back of his patrol car, the hard plastic of the seat felt unforgiving against her body. She twisted to look back at the scene she'd been ripped from. The mangled truck, the discarded medical supplies, the dumbfounded faces of the firefighters. It was a tableau of a rescue gone catastrophically wrong. She had done everything by the book. She had followed her training, adhered to every protocol, and put her patient's life above all else. And for that, she was in handcuffs, her career, her freedom, and another man's life hanging by the thinnest of threads. The patrol car door slammed shut, sealing her in a cage of suffocating heat and helplessness. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale air freshener and an undercurrent of human misery. A thick plexiglass partition separated her from Officer Thorne, who sat in the driver's seat, not driving, but tapping furiously on his dash-mounted laptop. He was already writing his report, building his official version of reality before the truth had a chance to put its boots on. He was crafting a narrative that would paint him as the calm professional and her as the unhinged, insubordinate woman who had created the chaos. Meanwhile, in the back of Ambulance 34, Sam Jones was living the nightmare Lena had predicted. Robert Miller's heart monitor, which had been displaying a frantic tachycardic rhythm, suddenly flatlined. The frantic beeping devolved into a single, terrifying, continuous tone. "No, no, no, damn it!" Sam yelled, his voice cracking with panic and rage. He was doing 80 miles an hour down the freeway, weaving through traffic, a one-man army fighting a war he was destined to lose. He couldn't drive and perform chest compressions at the same time. All he could do was drive faster. He slammed his palm on the radio button. "Dispatch, this is Ambulance 34. I have a patient in cardiac arrest. I'm 5 minutes out from Westlake General. Notify the ER. I need a full trauma team on standby." He was utterly alone. His partner, the person he trusted with his life, the expert who always knew the next 3 steps, was in the back of a police car because she had refused to move their ambulance 6 feet. The sheer, maddening injustice of it was a hot, bitter acid in his throat. He floored the accelerator, praying for a miracle he knew wouldn't come. He knew with a sickening, gut-wrenching certainty that every second of the delay Thorne had manufactured on scene was now being paid for in Robert Miller's blood. The platinum 10 minutes had been stolen. The seeds of chaos Thorne had sown were now being reaped, and the harvest was death. The drive to the downtown precinct was a blur of sun-bleached buildings and oppressive silence. When they finally pulled into the underground sally port, a heavy steel door groaned shut behind them, sealing Lena off from the world. Thorne led her out of the car, his hand still clamped on her arm, and marched her into the central booking area. The precinct was a chaotic hive of noise and motion. Phones rang incessantly, keyboards clattered, and officers moved about with a brusque sense of purpose, their voices echoing off the linoleum floors and drab concrete walls. As Lena was led toward the processing desk, a strange ripple of quiet followed in her wake. The cops and civilian staff were accustomed to seeing suspects in cuffs, but they were not accustomed to seeing one of them. Lena was still in her uniform, dark blue pants and a collared shirt with the Star of Life patch on the sleeve. It was a jarring sight, a symbol of help and healing now treated as a symbol of criminality. Heads turned, conversations paused. They didn't know her name, but they knew what she was. A first responder, one of their own, in a different uniform. The booking sergeant, a heavy-set man named Kowalski with a thick gray mustache and the weary eyes of a man who had seen it all, looked up from his paperwork. His eyes went from Lena's uniform to Thorne's rigid face, and his expression soured instantly. "Thorne, what in the hell is this?" he grumbled, his voice low. "Obstruction and resisting," Thorne stated flatly, as if he were booking a common drunk. "She was interfering at an MVA scene." Kowalski's gaze lingered on Lena's uniform, on the smudge of grease on her knee from kneeling on the road, on the profound exhaustion etched onto her face. He'd been a cop for 30 years. He knew a garbage arrest when he saw one. He let out a long, slow sigh that was a mix of frustration and resignation. "All right, put her over there." The process began, a systematic dehumanization designed to strip away her identity. Her pockets were emptied onto the metal counter. Her wallet, keys, phone, and sheathed trauma shears, tools she used to save lives, were unceremoniously dropped into a large Ziploc bag and labeled as evidence. They took her shoelaces and the belt from her uniform pants, small indignities meant to ensure she couldn't harm herself. Then came the fingerprints. A young female officer who looked barely old enough to be out of the academy gently took Lena's hands. She rolled each of Lena's fingers in black ink, then pressed them firmly onto a card. The young officer refused to make eye contact, her embarrassment a palpable presence in the sterile room. Lena remained silent through it all, her composure a shield. She answered their questions in a calm, even tone. Name: Lena Washington. Date of birth: May 12, 1989. Address, phone number, occupation. When she said paramedic, Sergeant Kowalski looked up from his computer screen and shot Thorne a look that could strip paint. "You got a problem, Sarge?" Thorne challenged, his tone defensive. "I got a paramedic in my booking cell because of you," Kowalski muttered, turning back to his keyboard. "Internal Affairs is going to have a field day with this paperwork." Next was the mugshot. She stood against a cinder block wall, a digital board with her name and a booking number held beneath her chin. The flash was blindingly bright. In that split second, she was no longer Lena Washington, decorated combat medic, 15-year veteran paramedic. She was inmate number 734, a number in a system that was grinding forward with a cold, indifferent momentum. They placed her in a holding cell. It was a small concrete box with a single metal bench and a toilet in the corner, smelling faintly of disinfectant and despair. The heavy door slammed shut with a deafening clang, the sound of the lock echoing the finality of the handcuffs. She was finally alone. The adrenaline that had carried her through the entire ordeal began to recede, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. She sat on the cold bench and finally allowed the mask to drop, burying her face in her hands. She thought of Robert Miller. Was he alive? Did Sam make it to the hospital in time? The uncertainty was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, heavier than any body armor she had ever worn. She had sworn an oath, first to her country and then to her community, to do no harm and to dedicate herself to saving lives. Today, a man with a badge and a fragile ego had prevented her from honoring that oath, and another man was going to pay the ultimate price. Through the small, barred window in the cell door, Lena could see the muted activity of the precinct. She saw Captain Davis from the fire department arrive, his face a thundercloud, and disappear into an office with a lieutenant. She saw other officers gathering in hushed groups, their conversations low and urgent as they glanced her way. The story was spreading. The initial shock was morphing into a low hum of departmental dread. They all knew how bad this looked. A cop arresting a medic for doing her job at a critical scene was a public relations atom bomb, an interagency catastrophe, and a lawsuit of biblical proportions waiting to happen. An hour crawled by. Then another. No one came to talk to her. No one read her Miranda rights. She was simply left to sit in the silent, sterile box, a prisoner of another man's pride. She wasn't afraid. The things she had seen in the war had burned most of the fear out of her long ago. What she felt now was a cold, quiet, simmering rage. Thorne hadn't just arrested her, he had disrespected her profession, he had endangered her patient, and he had shattered the sacred trust that exists between first responders. And he had done it all because he could, because his badge gave him the power and his arrogance demanded that he use it. He had made a catastrophic mistake. And as Lena sat on that cold metal bench, she made a quiet promise to herself. He was going to pay for it. The city was going to pay for it. While Lena was being processed, Sam Jones was at Westlake General, giving a frantic, disjointed report to the trauma team that had been waiting for them. They had pulled Robert Miller from the ambulance, his body limp and ashen. A doctor had immediately started CPR as they rushed him into the trauma bay. "Single vehicle MVA, prolonged extrication," Sam rattled off, his voice hoarse with stress. "Patient was hypotensive and tachycardic, then arrested about 5 minutes out. We were delayed on scene." The lead trauma surgeon, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Evans, didn't look up from her work. "Delayed by what? Where's your partner?" Sam's composure finally shattered. "She was arrested," he choked out. The entire room went still for a heartbeat. Dr. Evans looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "She was what?" "A cop arrested her for obstruction," Sam said, the words tumbling out in a torrent of grief and fury. "He wouldn't let us leave. He held us up for at least 6 or 7 minutes. Critical minutes." Dr. Evans stared at him, then back at the lifeless man on the table. She didn't need any more explanation. She knew what a 7-minute delay meant for a patient this far gone. It was a death sentence delivered by a man with a badge. "Get him to OR1, now!" she bellowed. "He threw a PE from the crush injuries. Let's move!" As the team wheeled Robert's body away, Sam slumped against the wall, the full weight of the afternoon crashing down on him. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely press the numbers. His first call was to their EMS supervisor. His second was to the president of the Paramedics Union. The union president, a fiery, tough-as-nails former paramedic named Susan Clark, listened to Sam's story without saying a word. When he finished, there was a moment of cold, dangerous silence on the other end of the line. "Sam," she said, her voice deceptively calm, "stay right where you are. I'm making one phone call. We're going to burn them to the ground for this." That one phone call was to a man named Julian Hayes. In legal circles, Hayes was known simply as the Bulldog. He was a civil rights attorney who had built a fearsome reputation by suing police departments for misconduct, and he rarely lost. He specialized in cases of wrongful arrest, excessive force, and malicious prosecution, turning the arrogance of bad cops into multi-million-dollar paydays for their victims. When Susan Clark called, Hayes was just leaving court. He listened to the details: the critical patient, the paramedic arrested for refusing to move an ambulance, the officer with a history of complaints, and he knew this wasn't just another case. This was a perfect storm of negligence, incompetence, and a stunning abuse of power, all directed at a sympathetic, heroic professional. It was the kind of case that made careers and changed cities. "Where is she now?" Hayes asked, his voice already shifting into a low, predatory gear. "Downtown precinct, holding cell," Susan replied. "I'm on my way," Hayes said, already turning toward his car. "Tell her partner not to speak to anyone else. Tell him to write down every single detail he remembers and get the names of every firefighter on scene. We're going to need them all." Less than an hour later, Julian Hayes, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that cost more than Lena's first car, strode into the downtown precinct. He projected an aura of expensive, unshakable authority that made Sergeant Kowalski instinctively sit up straighter. "I'm here to see my client, Lena Washington," he announced, his voice smooth as silk but with an undeniable core of steel. "My name is Julian Hayes." The name dropped into the room like a grenade. Every cop in the city knew who he was. Having Julian Hayes show up at your precinct meant you had screwed up on a spectacular level. Kowalski fumbled for his phone. A few minutes later, a harried-looking lieutenant appeared. After a brief, whispered conversation, Lena was escorted from her cell to a small, private interrogation room. When she walked in, she saw a tall, impeccably dressed black man who rose to his feet as she entered. "Ms. Washington," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Julian Hayes. Your union sent me. I'm here to get you out of this, and to make sure the people who put you here are held accountable." Lena looked at his confident smile and the expensive leather briefcase on the table. For the first time since the handcuffs had clicked shut, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was hope. While Julian Hayes was meeting with Lena, Officer Mark Thorne was in a quiet office upstairs, doing the most important work of his career. He was crafting his incident report. He knew this arrest was going to get a hard look. He'd seen the fury on Captain Davis's face and heard the disbelief in the dispatcher's voice. He understood that the only thing standing between him and a suspension, or worse, was his official written version of the events. His report had to be a fortress, an impenetrable document built on the unshakable foundation of his word as a sworn officer of the law. He began by painting the scene as one of chaos and public danger, which he, the agent of order, was attempting to rectify. He wrote that the ambulance was parked in a hazardous manner, completely obstructing a primary traffic artery, a gross exaggeration of a single blocked lane on a road already secured by a fire engine. He described Lena Washington not as a focused medical professional trying to save a life, but as agitated and confrontational from my initial contact. He wrote, "I gave the paramedic, later identified as Washington, a lawful order to move her vehicle to allow for safe scene management. She immediately became hostile, shouting that she would not comply with my directives." He conveniently omitted the fact that both she and the fire captain had clearly explained they were in the middle of a life-or-death extrication of a critically injured patient. He carefully curated his language to construct a narrative of escalating defiance on her part, not his. He claimed she assumed an aggressive physical posture, forcing him to create distance for officer safety. He twisted her calm, factual explanations about her patient's dire condition into a stream of insubordinate and belligerent statements. The arrest itself was portrayed as an unavoidable, reluctant last resort. When Paramedic Washington attempted to push past me, committing a physical assault on a police officer, I was left with no other option but to take her into custody to restore order and ensure the safety of other first responders. It was a complete fabrication, a masterpiece of self-serving fiction. Every phrase was meticulously chosen to trigger the key legal justifications that Internal Affairs and the department's lawyers looked for. Lawful order, officer safety, escalating aggression, physical assault. He had checked every box. He printed the report, signed it with a firm, confident hand, and submitted it into the system, believing that his word, the word of a man with a badge, would inherently carry more weight than that of an uncooperative paramedic. His confidence began to fray when he was summoned to his captain's office an hour later. Captain Miller was a stern, by-the-book commander who valued discipline, but, more than anything, despised lawsuits that made his department look bad. The supervising sergeant from the scene, a weary veteran named Hendricks, was already there, his expression grim. Thorne's freshly printed report was on the captain's desk between them. "Thorne, walk me through this," Captain Miller said, his voice deceptively calm. "You arrested a 15-year veteran paramedic, on her knees, in the middle of a trauma call." "Yes, sir," Thorne said, standing at parade rest. "She was non-compliant and became physically aggressive. It's all detailed in my report." "I've read your report," Miller said, tapping a single finger on the paper. "It says here she assaulted you. What were your injuries?" Thorne hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Sir, she pushed into me with her shoulder. It was the act of assault, not the severity of injury that necessitated the arrest." "What were your injuries, Thorne?" Miller repeated, his voice losing its calm edge. "I was not injured, sir." "So a female paramedic who you outweigh by at least 50 pounds assaulted you without leaving so much as a red mark," Miller said, his skepticism hanging heavy in the air. "And you stated her ambulance was blocking access. Sergeant Hendricks's initial report says there were no other emergency vehicles trying to access the scene. The fire engine and rescue squad were already there. So who exactly was she blocking?" "Sir, it was a matter of clearing the roadway for potential civilian traffic." It was a closed-off accident scene, Mark, Sergeant Hendricks cut in, his frustration finally boiling over. The road was blocked with our flares 200 yards in each direction. There was no civilian traffic. I was there 10 minutes after you. Thorne's face began to flush. His carefully constructed fortress was already starting to show cracks under the first light of scrutiny. He had built it on a foundation of sand. The fire captain, Bill Davis, also filed a report, Captain Miller continued, picking up another sheet of paper. A man I've known for 25 years and whose word is beyond reproach. He says you were out of control, needlessly escalated a stable scene, and directly interfered with life-saving medical care. His version is corroborated by all 6 of his firefighters. So I've got 7 decorated first responders telling me one story and you telling me another. Thorne stood in stony silence, his mind racing. He had grossly underestimated the blowback. He had assumed the thin blue line would offer some measure of protection. But this wasn't a cop versus a civilian. This was one cop versus 2 entire emergency service departments. He was the odd man out. There's one final piece to this puzzle, Thorne, Captain Miller said, leaning forward, his eyes like chips of ice. Your body camera. I've requested the footage. It's being downloaded as we speak. I trust that everything I see on that video will perfectly align with the detailed account in your sworn report. The color drained from Officer Thorne's face. The body camera. In his rage, in his single-minded obsession with asserting his dominance, he had completely forgotten about the small black lens mounted on his chest, the silent, impartial witness that had recorded every word, every gesture, every damning second of his catastrophic failure in judgment. His meticulously crafted report was about to be annihilated by the one thing he couldn't argue with or intimidate, the unblinking eye of the camera. The footage was downloaded and ready within the hour. Captain Miller, Sergeant Hendricks, and the precinct's internal affairs liaison, a sharp lieutenant named Wells, gathered in a small, windowless viewing room. The only light emanated from the large monitor on the wall. Miller clicked play. The video began with Officer Thorne pulling up to the accident. The first thing the camera captured was the ambulance, parked precisely as Lena and Sam had been trained to park it, at an angle, creating a protective buffer zone for the rescue workers. It was a textbook procedure. The camera's sensitive microphone picked up the sounds of the extrication, the high-pitched whine of the hydraulic tool, the clipped professional commands of the firefighters, and Lena's calm voice assessing her patient. The scene was a model of controlled, professional urgency. There was no chaos until Thorne himself introduced it. The microphone, pinned to Thorne's chest, captured his first words in crystal-clear audio. This ambulance is blocking the eastbound lane. You need to move it. There was no preamble, no, how can I help? Just an immediate confrontational order. The camera recorded Sam Jones's confused reply and, more importantly, Lena Washington's calm, professional response from beside the wrecked truck. That vehicle isn't moving until my patient is safely on his way to the hospital. We have a life-threatening emergency, officer. Her voice was firm but respectful, the tone of a professional stating a fact. There was absolutely no hint of the hostility or belligerence Thorne had so vividly described in his report. The 3 men in the room watched in stony silence as the video version of Mark Thorne ignored the fire captain's logical explanation, dismissed the visible life-or-death reality of the rescue, and relentlessly escalated the situation. The camera showed him stepping directly into Lena's path as she tried to move with the backboard, unequivocally proving he was the one creating the obstruction, not her. It showed him putting his hand up to block her, a clear act of physical intimidation. "Pause it right there," Captain Miller said, his voice tight. "Wells, does she look like she's in an aggressive physical posture to you?" Lieutenant Wells, a man who had seen every flavor of police misconduct in his IA career, slowly shook his head. "She looks like she's trying to do her job, Captain." They continued the video. The camera captured Lena's clear, precise explanation of Robert Miller's medical condition, the hemorrhagic shock, the impending cardiac arrest. It was a final, desperate plea for reason, an attempt to de-escalate using medical facts. Thorne's response, also captured in perfect fidelity, was chilling. "You're done giving orders." Then came the most damning sequence. The camera lens, pointed directly down, showed Thorne's hand grabbing Lena's arm. It recorded her cry of protest, not for herself, but for her patient. It recorded the sharp, metallic sound of the handcuffs being unclipped, a percussive indictment of his actions. At no point in the video did Lena Washington ever push, shove, or make any physical contact that could be remotely interpreted as an assault. The assault that Thorne had used as the entire legal justification for his arrest was a complete and utter lie. The camera continued to roll as Thorne marched her to his patrol car, capturing the shocked and disgusted faces of the firefighters. It recorded her final warning from the back seat about her patient's condition and Thorne's callous, chilling reply. The video ended. For a full minute, the only sound in the dark room was the quiet hum of the computer. Captain Miller stared at the blank screen, his face a grim, furious mask. The fortress Thorne had built with his report hadn't just been contradicted, it had been leveled, nuked from orbit. The video proved he had deliberately, knowingly, and maliciously lied about every single key aspect of the encounter. He had fabricated a felony assault to justify an unlawful arrest, an arrest that was the direct result of his own fragile, pathetic ego. "Well," Lieutenant Wells said, finally breaking the thick silence, "this is what the lawyers call indefensible." Sergeant Hendricks just rubbed his temples, a migraine already forming. "The Union is going to crucify us. The city is going to get sued into the next century." Captain Miller stood up and walked to the door, his movements stiff with rage. "Get Thorne in my office now, and someone call the district attorney's office. Tell them we are dropping all charges against Paramedic Washington, effective immediately." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "And get an officer to drive Ms. Washington home. The last thing we need is for her to take a cab from our precinct after we falsely arrested her." The wheels of damage control were beginning to turn, but everyone in that room knew it was far too little, far too late. The body camera had done its job. It had captured the objective, irrefutable truth. And the truth was that one of their own had committed a fireable offense, broken the law, and exposed the city to a level of legal and financial liability that was staggering to even comprehend. The footage was no longer just evidence. It was a ticking time bomb. Lena was released less than 3 hours after her arrest. The charges were dropped so quickly she didn't even finish the out-processing paperwork. A young, deeply apologetic officer drove her home in a marked patrol car, the irony of which was a bitter pill. She walked into her small, quiet apartment, still wearing her stained uniform, the skin on her wrists rubbed red and raw from the handcuffs. She sank onto her sofa in the dark, the day's events replaying in her mind on a torturous loop. It wasn't until her phone rang and she saw Sam's name on the screen that the dam of her professional composure finally broke. "Is he?" she asked, unable to bring herself to finish the sentence. "He's alive," Sam said, his voice thick with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Barely. He coded twice on the table, Lena. They had to crack his chest right there in the ER. He's in the surgical ICU, but it's bad. The doctors said the delay, the prolonged lack of oxygen to his brain, they don't know what the neurological damage is yet." He was alive. The relief was so immense it felt like a physical blow, almost bringing her to her knees. But it was a victory hollowed out by the bitter reality of what that delay had truly cost Robert Miller. She had saved him from death on the roadside, only for a police officer to sentence him to a different kind of prison, one inside his own body. The rage returned, cold and clear. An apology from the police department and a dropped charge wasn't going to be enough. It wasn't even going to be close. The next morning, Lena met with Julian Hayes at his downtown law office. The space was a testament to his success. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a panoramic view of the city skyline, modern art on the walls, and shelves lined with thick, leather-bound law books. Hayes had already been working through the night. He'd gotten a full statement from Sam and the names of all the firefighters. He'd received a copy of Thorne's fraudulent incident report and, more importantly, a copy of the now infamous body cam footage from a source within the DA's office who was disgusted by what had happened. He'd also had a preliminary conversation with Robert Miller's terrified and bewildered wife. "I've seen the video, Lena," Hayes said, his voice a calm, reassuring rumble. "It's even worse than I imagined. His actions weren't just unprofessional, they were unconstitutional. He violated your Fourth Amendment rights by arresting you without a shred of probable cause. But more egregiously, he violated Mr. Miller's fundamental right to life by actively interfering with his medical care." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "The city knows they are in serious trouble. They're going to want to make this go away quietly. They'll offer you a quick settlement, maybe $100,000. They'll make you sign a non-disclosure agreement so the public never hears the full story." "I don't want their hush money," Lena said, her voice as hard as forged steel. "I want to make sure this never happens to another paramedic again. I want him off the street." A slow, predatory smile spread across Julian Hayes's face. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." 3 days later, the lawsuit was filed. It wasn't a simple claim for damages in state court. Hayes went federal. The complaint was a 60-page legal declaration of war. Lena Washington versus Officer Mark Thorne, the city of Westlake, and the Westlake Police Department. It alleged a litany of civil rights violations, including unlawful arrest, false imprisonment, malicious prosecution, and the most damning count of all, a state-created danger by actively and knowingly interfering with life-sustaining medical treatment. The complaint didn't just name Officer Thorne, it named the city and the department, arguing that they had a pattern and practice of failing to properly train and discipline their officers, citing Thorne's 12 prior citizen complaints as Exhibit A. It argued that the city's deliberate indifference to his history of aggressive behavior had directly led to the violation of Lena's rights and the catastrophic, life-altering injuries to Robert Miller. And then there was the question of damages. Hayes wasn't asking for $100,000. He was asking for $15.2 million. The number was audacious, shocking, and deliberately chosen. It was a figure designed to make front-page headlines, to make the city council choke on their morning coffee, and to send an unmistakable signal that this was not a nuisance lawsuit to be quietly settled. It was an existential threat. It was the price tag he was placing on a few minutes of a police officer's wounded pride. The filing hit the city like a shockwave. The local news media, tipped off by Hayes's office, led their evening broadcast with the story, complete with Lena's mugshot juxtaposed against a photo of her in her paramedic's uniform. The city manager's office was immediately flooded with angry calls. The police chief was forced to hold a press conference where he grimly announced that Officer Thorne had been placed on administrative leave pending a full internal investigation. The story was out. There would be no quiet settlement, no sweeping this under the rug. Protesters, organized by a local activist group, began to gather outside the police precinct, their signs demanding "Justice for Lena" and "Fire Thorne now." Julian Hayes had ensured that the battle would be fought not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. While the legal and political storm raged outside, Robert Miller was fighting a much more personal and silent battle inside the sterile walls of Westlake General's neurological ICU. He had survived the surgery, a testament to the skill of Dr. Evans and her team, but the victory was a hollow one. The prolonged period of cardiac arrest, a direct result of the delay on scene, had starved his brain of oxygen. The damage was catastrophic and irreversible. He had suffered a massive stroke on the operating table. The man who woke up was not the same man who had been driving to work that morning. He was trapped in a body that had betrayed him. He had severe left-sided paralysis, his arm and leg limp and useless. The man who had once effortlessly climbed scaffolding on construction sites and coached his son's Little League team could no longer hold a cup or stand on his own. Worse than the physical toll, however, was the cognitive damage. He was suffering from severe aphasia, a cruel condition that scrambled the brain's ability to process and produce language. He knew what he wanted to say, the thoughts were there, clear in his mind, but they would emerge as a frustrating, unintelligible jumble of disconnected words and sounds. The brilliant, practical mind that could read complex blueprints and manage a crew of 50 men could no longer form a simple sentence to ask for a glass of water. His world had shrunk to a hospital bed, a wheelchair, and the constant, maddening prison of his own mind. His wife, Maria, a kind, gentle woman who was now a ghost of her former self, had to quit her job as a librarian to become his full-time caregiver. Their 2 adult children, who lived in different states, took turns flying in, their visits a painful, heartbreaking ordeal as they struggled to connect with the vibrant, funny father they had lost. As part of the discovery phase of the lawsuit, Julian Hayes' team subpoenaed Robert Miller's complete medical file. It was a heartbreaking document. Thousands of pages of clinical notes, brain scans, and therapy assessments that detailed the stark, unvarnished consequences of Officer Thorne's actions. The records painted a grim picture of a future filled with round-the-clock care, endless therapy, and zero chance of any meaningful recovery. The golden hour had been squandered, and the cost was a man's entire life. Hayes knew he needed to put a human face on this tragedy for the court and for a potential jury. He arranged to take Robert Miller's deposition at the long-term rehabilitation facility he had been moved to. It was a difficult but legally necessary step. They needed his testimony, or his attempt at it, on the record. Hayes, a court reporter, and the city's attorneys gathered in a small, sterile conference room. Robert was wheeled in by a nurse, with Maria at his side, her hand resting reassuringly on his shoulder. The city's lead attorney, a man named Gerald Finney, began the questioning, looking visibly uncomfortable. He tried to establish that Robert's memory of the accident itself was cloudy, a tactic to undermine his credibility. But Hayes had a different strategy. He wasn't there to ask Robert about the crash. He was there to show the world what Robert's life had become. When it was his turn, Hayes approached gently. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice soft. "Before the accident, can you tell us what you did for a living?" Robert's face contorted with the immense effort of trying to summon a single word. He opened his mouth, and a stream of garbled sounds emerged. "Build. Work. Tall. No!" He slammed his good hand down on the arm of his wheelchair in sheer frustration, his eyes welling up with tears of rage and helplessness. Maria reached out and squeezed his hand, whispering words of encouragement only he could hear. Hayes let the painful silence hang in the air for a long moment before moving on. "Mr. Miller, do you have any grandchildren?" Robert's face lit up for a fleeting second. "Yes," he managed, the word emerging clear and bright. A small victory. "Her name is Lily. Can you tell us about Lily?" The struggle returned. "She... park... run... book..." He couldn't finish. He buried his face in his one good hand, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. He could no longer read a story to his granddaughter. He could no longer chase her across the grass. These simple, precious joys had been stolen from him. Finally, Thorne turned to Maria. "Mrs. Miller, can you describe the changes in your husband since that day?" Maria took a deep, shuddering breath, her voice trembling but steady. "The man I married is gone," she said, looking directly at the city's lawyers. "He's still in there, I know he is, but he's trapped. He can't work, he can't walk, he can't speak. We were supposed to retire in 2 years. We were going to buy an RV and see the country. Now, our world is this room. And it's all because a police officer couldn't wait 5 minutes." Her voice broke on the last words, and she began to weep. The deposition was over. The video recording of it was the most powerful piece of evidence Julian Hayes could ever have hoped for. It was a heartbreaking, unassailable portrait of a life and a family shattered by one man's unforgivable arrogance. The centerpiece of the discovery process was the deposition of Officer Mark Thorne himself. He arrived at Julian Hayes's high-rise office flanked by two stone-faced attorneys from the city's legal department. He wore a crisp, dark suit, his posture as rigid and unyielding as ever. But there was a new, visible tension around his eyes and a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. He was no longer on his own turf. In this polished conference room with its panoramic city views, Julian Hayes was the one with all the authority. The entire deposition was being recorded on video, a small, discreet camera in the corner of the room capturing every flicker of expression, every defensive shift in his seat. For 8 grueling hours, Hayes systematically and surgically picked apart Thorne's story, his questions like a series of precise, deliberate cuts. "Officer Thorne," Hayes began, his tone deceptively calm and conversational. "In your official report, you stated that Paramedic Washington's ambulance was creating a significant public safety hazard. Could you please describe that hazard for us?" "It was blocking a lane of traffic," Thorne recited, sticking to the script he had clearly rehearsed. "A lane of traffic on a road that had been completely closed off to the public with police flares, 200 yards in each direction, by your own department." "Is that correct?" Hayes asked, not looking up from his notes. Thorne hesitated. "It was about maintaining a clear path for other potential emergency vehicles." "But there were no other emergency vehicles attempting to access the scene, were there, officer?" "Not at that specific moment, no." "So the significant public safety hazard you described in your sworn report didn't actually exist in reality, did it?" The city's attorney objected. "Argumentative." Hayes just smiled, a thin, cold smile. "I'll rephrase. Was there any actual present danger caused by the placement of that ambulance, officer? Yes or no?" Thorne shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It was a violation of protocol." "Whose protocol, officer?" Hayes pressed. "Because both the fire department and the paramedic service are trained to use their vehicles to create a safe working space around a wreck, a practice known as blocking. Were you aware of this standard life-saving procedure?" "I am not trained in paramedic procedure," Thorne mumbled, his eyes fixed on the table. "Precisely," Hayes said, his voice like silk. "And yet you felt that your judgment regarding traffic management was more important than the senior paramedic's judgment regarding her dying patient. Is that a fair assessment?" Again the objection came, and again Hayes moved on, having already made his point for the camera. He spent the next hour dissecting Thorne's claim that Lena had been hostile and confrontational. He played short, humiliating snippets from the body camera audio, forcing Thorne to listen to Lena's calm, professional voice, and then asked him to explain specifically how her tone constituted belligerence. Thorne's answers became clipped and defensive. It was her tone. She was insubordinate. She refused a lawful order. He was being backed into a corner by his own lies, his own words now weaponized against him. The climax of the deposition came when Hayes addressed the fabricated assault. He played the relevant section of the body camera video on a large monitor for everyone in the room to see. He paused it at the exact moment Thorne claimed Lena had pushed him. "Officer Thorne," Hayes said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, "please point to the moment in this video where Ms. Washington assaults you." Thorne stared at the frozen image on the screen. It showed Lena standing perfectly still, her hands at her side as he grabbed her arm. There was no push, no shove, no contact initiated by her whatsoever. The video was irrefutable. She tensed up," Thorne stammered, his carefully constructed composure finally cracking. "It was a form of resistance, a pre-assaultive indicator." "A pre-assaultive indicator?" Hayes repeated the phrase, letting the sheer absurdity of it hang in the air. "So, you arrested a veteran paramedic for felony assault on an officer, not because she actually touched you in any way, but because you thought she might have tensed her muscles. Is that your sworn testimony here today, officer?" The room was silent. Thorne stared at the screen, his face pale, the sweat on his brow now clearly visible. The camera zoomed in on his face. He was trapped, exposed, and utterly defeated. The fortress of lies he had built in his report had been publicly and permanently demolished, and his own body camera had provided the dynamite. With Thorne's deposition on video, the city's legal position shifted from precarious to catastrophic. They were no longer defending a police officer. They were defending a proven liar whose actions had led to a man's permanent disability. The city's lead attorney, Gerald Finney, knew that if a jury ever saw that video, the case was over. His only goal now was to stop it from ever getting to a courtroom. He called Julian Hayes. "Julian," he began, attempting a collegial tone. "We've reviewed the evidence, and while we don't concede liability, we recognize that litigation is costly and unpredictable for all parties. To avoid a protracted and painful trial, the city is prepared to offer your client a settlement of $250,000. Hayes listened patiently, then let out a short, sharp laugh that was pure contempt. "Gerald, are you serious? That might cover my team's photocopying costs. My client was publicly humiliated, falsely arrested, and prevented from saving a man's life. We are not in the same zip code, let alone the same ballpark. Call me back when you're ready to have a real conversation." He hung up the phone. 2 weeks later, after Hayes filed a motion to compel the release of Thorne's 12 prior citizen complaints, Finney called again. The desperation in his voice was palpable. The offer had gone up to $1 million. Thorne took the offer to Lena. They sat in the same conference room where they had first met, the sprawling city visible through the window behind him. "It's a significant amount of money," Hayes said, his tone neutral. "It would change your life, but it will come with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. You could never speak publicly about what happened to you. Officer Thorne would likely be allowed to resign quietly, find a job in another jurisdiction, and the department would never have to publicly admit any wrongdoing. It's their way of buying your silence." Lena looked out the window, her gaze fixed on the Westlake General Hospital building in the distance, where she knew Robert Miller was still struggling through his painful and uncertain rehabilitation. "Did you tell them about Robert's latest medical evaluation?" she asked quietly. "I did," Hayes said. "They know he will never walk or speak normally again. They know his lifetime cost of care will be in the tens of millions. They are fully aware of the damage." "And they offer this?" Lena said, a disgusted edge to her voice. "This isn't about me. It was never just about me. If I take this money and sign their NDA, what changes? What stops the next Officer Thorne from doing the exact same thing to another paramedic next year? To another Sam or another firefighter?" She turned from the window to look Hayes directly in the eye. "The answer is no. We don't settle. Not for this." Hayes nodded slowly, a flicker of deep respect and pride in his eyes. He had known what her answer would be, but he was obligated to present the offer. "I agree," he said. "So, we press on." The city's legal team was in a full-blown panic. Julian Hayes wasn't behaving like a typical plaintiff's attorney. He wasn't just posturing for a bigger payday. He seemed genuinely willing, even eager, to take the case all the way to a jury. And the optics of that trial were the stuff of nightmares for any city attorney. They would have to put a decorated, articulate African-American female paramedic on the stand to recount her ordeal. They would have to listen to the heartbreaking testimony of the Miller family. All of this would be contrasted with the video of their arrogant, dishonest white police officer. They wouldn't just lose, they would be publicly humiliated and financially annihilated. Their desperation led them to one final, insulting legal gambit. They filed a motion in federal court arguing that Lena Washington shared contributory negligence for her own arrest. Their argument, in essence, was that if she had simply complied with the lawful order to move her ambulance in the first place, none of the subsequent events would have happened. They were blaming the victim, arguing that her decision to prioritize her patient's life over an officer's command made her partially responsible for the outcome. The motion was a spectacular miscalculation. It infuriated the federal judge, who dismissed it from the bench with a scathing lecture about wasting the court's time. It also leaked to the press, and the resulting public outcry was immense. The Paramedics Union organized a protest on the steps of City Hall, this time joined by the Firefighters Union, who issued a statement condemning the police department and the city's despicable legal strategy. Editorials were written calling for Officer Thorne's immediate termination and City Attorney Gerald Finney's resignation. The city had tried to play hardball, and in doing so, they had managed to unite every first responder in the region against them and turn public opinion into a raging inferno. Gerald Finney's desperate gambit had backfired completely. He had wanted to intimidate Lena into a cheap settlement. Instead, he had made her a local hero and turned her lawsuit into a crusade for the rights of all first responders. The price tag for the city's mistake had just gone up exponentially. With a trial date looming and their legal options exhausted, the city's lawyers made one last attempt to avoid a public courtroom execution. They agreed to non-binding mediation, a process where a neutral third party, typically a retired judge, attempts to broker a settlement between the two sides. They were hoping a mediator could talk some sense into Julian Hayes and his client to convince them to accept a reasonable multi-million-dollar figure and avoid the unpredictable circus of a jury trial. They met in a sterile suite of offices belonging to the mediation firm. The mediator was a man named Judge Harrison, a 70-year-old veteran of the federal bench, known for his sharp mind and no-nonsense demeanor. Lena was there, dressed in a simple but professional black suit, her composure as unshakable as ever. Julian Hayes sat beside her, exuding a quiet, lethal confidence. On the other side of the large mahogany table sat Gerald Finney and two other city attorneys, their faces drawn and anxious. The morning was spent with each side presenting their case to Judge Harrison. Finney went first, making a weak, tired argument about Officer Thorne's duty to maintain public order and portraying Lena's refusal to move her ambulance as a failure to de-escalate. He stressed that the city had already taken action by placing Thorne on administrative leave and had offered a substantial settlement. It was a flimsy, pathetic defense, and everyone in the room knew it. Then it was Thorne's turn. He didn't make an emotional speech. He didn't raise his voice. He simply, methodically presented the evidence. He played the body cam footage in its entirety. He played the most damning clips from Officer Thorne's disastrous deposition, highlighting the moments where he contradicted his own report and stammered through his lies. And then he played the most powerful weapon in his arsenal, the video of Robert Miller's deposition. He played the clip of Robert struggling to say his own profession. He played the clip of him breaking down when trying to talk about his granddaughter. He played the clip of Maria Miller describing how the man she married was gone. When the video ended, the room was utterly, profoundly silent. The city's lawyers stared at the polished surface of the table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Judge Harrison, a man who had presided over gruesome murder trials and complex corporate fraud cases, slowly took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked genuinely shaken. "We'll take a break," he said, his voice husky. When they reconvened an hour later, the atmosphere had changed. Judge Harrison asked to speak to the city's legal team alone. Lena and Hayes waited in a separate room. They didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes later, they were called back in. Judge Harrison looked directly at Gerald Finney, his expression one of profound disbelief and judicial fury. "In my 30 years on the bench," he began, his voice low and grave, "I have rarely seen a case with a more indefensible set of facts. You have a police officer on camera fabricating a felony charge. You have him on camera admitting to his lies in a sworn deposition. You have 7 independent, decorated witnesses from 2 different emergency services who all state that your officer was the sole cause of this entire catastrophe." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But that is not your biggest problem. Your biggest problem is that you are going to put that man, Robert Miller, in a wheelchair in front of a jury of 12 ordinary citizens. You are going to let them watch him cry because he can't say his own granddaughter's name. And then his wife is going to get on the stand and tell them it's all because your police officer couldn't be bothered to wait 5 minutes." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Finney's. "Let me be blunt, counselor. You are not going to win this case. You are going to lose. And you are going to lose so badly that the number Mr. Hayes has put in his complaint is going to start to look like a bargain. A jury is going to see that body cam footage as a grotesque and racist abuse of power. They are going to see Robert Miller as a man whose life was destroyed for no reason at all. And they are going to want to punish you. They will come back with a verdict that will financially cripple this city for a decade. He sat back, his assessment delivered like a death sentence. My advice to you is to stop playing games. Go back to your city council, show them these videos, and tell them to write a check big enough to make this go away. Because if you let this case go to a jury, God help you all. The mediator's warning was not a suggestion. It was the death knell for the city's defense. The last shred of hope they had of mitigating the damage had just been vaporized. They were cornered, outmaneuvered, and facing a legal and financial catastrophe entirely of their own making. Judge Harrison's blunt, brutal assessment was the shockwave the Westlake City Council desperately needed. Faced with the mediator's dire prediction and the looming spectacle of a nationally televised trial, their will to fight completely evaporated. The fantasy that they could somehow defend Officer Thorne's actions dissolved, replaced by the grim, pragmatic reality of fiscal survival. A jury verdict could be $20, $30, even $40 million, an amount that would necessitate massive budget cuts, public service reductions, and potential municipal bankruptcy. The political and financial risk was simply too great. The negotiations that followed were swift and decisive. Gerald Finney, humbled and utterly defeated, was now focused on a single goal: damage control. The city's initial insulting offers were ancient history. The conversation now started and ended with the number Julian Hayes had put on his initial complaint. But Hayes, holding all the cards, was in complete control. He wasn't just negotiating for money, he was negotiating for justice and for systemic, lasting change. The final settlement was reached after a marathon session that stretched late into the night. It was a total capitulation by the city. First, the city agreed to pay the full settlement amount, $15.2 million. It was one of the largest settlements for a police misconduct case in the state's history, a staggering sum that was a testament to the scale of the damage done. A significant portion was placed in a lifetime trust for Robert Miller and his family, guaranteeing that his immense medical and caregiving needs would be met for the rest of his life. The remainder was for Lena, compensation for the violation of her rights, the damage to her reputation, and the profound emotional trauma of the ordeal. But for Lena and Hayes, the money was only part of the victory. The settlement agreement included a set of non-negotiable terms that were, in many ways, even more important. Officer Mark Thorne was to be terminated from the Westlake Police Department, effective immediately. There would be no quiet resignation, no chance for him to get a job in a neighboring town. He would be fired for cause, his career in law enforcement permanently over. The city also had to issue a formal public apology to Lena Washington and to the family of Robert Miller. The apology had to explicitly state that Officer Thorne's actions were a gross violation of departmental policy and had directly interfered with life-saving emergency medical care. There would be no weasel words, no passive voice regrets. It had to be a direct admission of fault. Third, and most crucially for Lena, the Westlake Police Department was required to completely overhaul its training protocols regarding interactions with other first responders. They had to work directly with the paramedics and firefighters unions to create a new mandatory training curriculum for every officer on the force. This curriculum would explicitly state that at a medical emergency, the ranking paramedic on scene has ultimate authority over patient care decisions, and that any non-exigent interference by law enforcement would be grounds for immediate disciplinary action. This wasn't just a policy change, it was a fundamental shift in the culture of the department, enshrined in a legally binding document. The settlement was announced at a packed press conference the following week. Julian Hayes stood at the podium with Lena Washington at his side. She was not in a suit, but in her paramedic's uniform, her expression calm and resolute. Hayes laid out the terms of the agreement, his voice clear and strong. He didn't gloat or celebrate. He simply stated the facts, ending with a powerful statement that resonated across the country. This settlement is a victory not just for Lena Washington, but for every paramedic, every firefighter, every first responder who has ever been obstructed while trying to save a life, he declared, the flashbulbs of cameras reflecting in his eyes. Let this be a clear message to law enforcement agencies everywhere. The badge is not a license to bully. All right must be tempered with judgment. And there is no authority more important than the sacred duty to preserve human life. The price for forgetting that lesson, as the city of Westlake learned, is steep. The money would ultimately be paid by the city's taxpayers, a harsh but necessary consequence for a municipality that had allowed an officer like Mark Thorne to operate with impunity for far too long. The $15.2 million settlement wasn't just a payment. It was an invoice. It was the bill for one officer's fragile ego, for 12 unheeded citizen complaints, for a system that protected its own instead of the public it was sworn to serve. It was the final, devastating price of a power trip that had lasted only a few minutes, but would cost a city, a family, and a dedicated paramedic for years to come. The settlement was a resounding victory, but its impact rippled far beyond the city limits of Westlake. The story, with its shocking body camera footage and staggering price tag, became a national case study in the consequences of police overreach and interagency conflict. It was dissected on cable news, written about in major newspapers, and analyzed in law journals. Lena Washington, a woman who had never sought the spotlight, found herself an unwitting and reluctant symbol of professional integrity and quiet courage. The case caught the attention of a state senator named Maria Flores, a former prosecutor who chaired the state's Judiciary Committee. She saw the incident not as an isolated event, but as a symptom of a systemic problem. She had heard anecdotal stories for years about friction between law enforcement and other emergency services. Lena Washington's case provided her with the political ammunition she needed to enact meaningful, statewide change. Senator Flores contacted Julian Hayes and the leaders of the state's first responder unions. Together, they began to draft a new piece of legislation aimed at preventing a similar tragedy from ever happening again. They called it the First Responder Protection Act. Unofficially, everyone knew it as Lena's Law. The proposed law was simple but powerful. It legally codified the long-standing but often ignored protocol that at the scene of a medical emergency, the senior-most medical provider is in command of all aspects of patient care. It made it a criminal offense for any person, including a law enforcement officer, to knowingly and willfully interfere with the duties of an on-duty paramedic or EMT. The law explicitly stated that a first responder's decision to prioritize patient care over a non-emergent request from law enforcement could not be used as grounds for obstruction or any other criminal charge. To build support for the bill, Lena Washington, who had initially shied away from the publicity, made a difficult decision. She agreed to testify before the state legislature. She walked into the state capitol building not in a suit, but in her crisp paramedic's uniform. She stood before the committee and in a clear, unwavering voice recounted the events of that terrible day. She didn't speak with anger, but with the calm, factual precision of a professional describing a critical incident. "I am not here today to talk about myself," she concluded, her eyes scanning the faces of the legislators. "I am here to talk about my patient, Robert Miller, and about the next Robert Miller, the person who will be in a car crash tomorrow or have a heart attack next week. When that happens, the paramedic who responds needs to be able to do their job without fear of being arrested. They need to be able to make decisions based on their medical training, not on the ego of the officer standing next to them. This law will protect us so that we can protect you." Her testimony was powerful, but the most impactful moment came when the next person was called to speak. Maria Miller, Robert's wife, came forward. She didn't speak about legal principles or policy. She spoke about her husband. She described their life before the accident and their life now. She played a short, silent video on the overhead screens, a home movie from the previous year showing a laughing, vibrant Robert dancing with his granddaughter at her birthday party. Then she looked at the committee, her eyes filled with a grief that was raw and profound. "My husband is a good man," she said, her voice cracking. "He is alive today because of Lena Washington's courage, but he will spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair because of one officer's pride. Please, pass this law. Do it for the next family so they never have to know this pain." The combination of Lena's professional testimony and Maria's heartbreaking plea was unstoppable. The bill passed through the committee unanimously. It went to the full legislature, where it passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. 3 months later, the governor signed it into law in a public ceremony on the steps of the Capitol. Lena Washington stood beside him, along with Maria Miller and the leaders of the state's fire and EMS unions. The passage of Lena's law was the final, most meaningful outcome of the entire ordeal. The settlement had provided financial justice. The officer's termination had provided accountability, but the law provided a legacy. It transformed a personal trauma into a legal shield for thousands of other first responders. It ensured that Lena's fight would have a lasting protective impact, creating a firewall between life-saving care and law enforcement overreach, guaranteeing that in the future, the Platinum 10 minutes would belong to the patient, not to the police. Years passed. The city of Westlake paid its settlement, implemented its new training protocols, and slowly, the memory of the scandal faded from the front pages. Mark Thorne, stripped of his badge and his career, moved out of state, becoming a footnote in a cautionary tale told to new police recruits about the catastrophic cost of arrogance. Robert Miller lived out his days in the quiet, frustrating world of rehabilitation, his mind and body a permanent testament to the cost of a few bad minutes. Life for most people moved on. But for Lena Washington, the incident became a permanent part of her professional landscape. She continued to work as a paramedic, riding in the same ambulance, responding to the same kinds of emergencies. She never quit. But something had changed. A quiet vigilance had settled deep within her. Every time she arrived at a scene and saw a police cruiser, she felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. The scars from that day weren't on her wrists anymore. They were etched into her soul. Her case lived on as an essential teaching tool in academies across the country, a stark example of how not to behave. She had fought for one patient on one hot afternoon, and in doing so, had ended up fighting for them all. When we dissect the tragedy that unfolded on that roadside, it's easy to focus on the explosive confrontation. But the seeds of that $15.2 million disaster were planted long before. They were sown in the mind of Officer Mark Thorne, likely stemming from a psychological cocktail of insecurity and a rigid, authoritarian worldview. For some individuals, the uniform isn't a symbol of public service, but a shield for personal inadequacy. Every challenge to their authority, no matter how small or reasonable, is perceived as a direct attack on their self-worth. In that moment, Lena Washington wasn't a fellow first responder to Thorne. She was a threat to his absolute control. His 12 prior complaints were not just a paper trail. They were 12 missed opportunities for intervention. 12 moments where the system could have recognized a dangerous pattern and acted before it culminated in catastrophe. What if Lena had simply complied? She would have avoided arrest, but she would have betrayed her patient, and Robert Miller would almost certainly have died on the scene. Her decision to stand firm was not the easy choice, but it was the only morally correct one. To protect herself better in that moment, perhaps the only other tool she had was to immediately request a police supervisor, though given Thorne's rapid escalation, it's doubtful he would have allowed it. Her true protection came not from her actions during the conflict, but from her flawless professionalism before it and the unblinking eye of the camera that captured it all. The ultimate lesson here is one of profound and sobering responsibility. It teaches us that true authority is not demanded at the end of a threat. It is earned through respect, competence, and sound judgment. An officer's ego has no place at an emergency scene. When it is allowed to take precedence over human life, the cost is not just measured in dollars from taxpayers' pockets, but in the irreplaceable currency of shattered lives and stolen futures. What do you think could have been done to prevent this situation from ever happening? Do you believe the settlement and the legal changes were enough to truly fix the problem? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.